The pre-dawn darkness clung to Bagram Airfield like a predator's breath. Captain Sarah Viper Chen stood alone outside the squadron operations building, cradling a styrofoam cup of coffee that had gone cold sometime during the night shift. She'd been awake for 32 hours straight, not unusual for her, not unusual for anyone flying combat missions in the Hindu Kush. Her dark eyes, framed by exhaustion and experience, scanned the runway where her A-10 Thunderbolt II sat waiting like a patient beast. Even in the darkness, she could see the scars across its fuselage. 32 confirmed combat engagements etched into the titanium skin like notches on a warrior's belt. Sarah was 36 years old, though something in her face suggested she'd lived much longer. The military does that. It ages you in ways that have nothing to do with years and everything to do with responsibility. She'd been flying combat sorties since 2018, and in those 6 years, she'd become something more than a pilot. She'd become a legend. The call sign, Viper, hadn't come easy. Back in 2021, during her first deployment, she was just another female fighter jock in a male-dominated community, capable, qualified, but not yet legendary. The name came after a mission that still got retold in squadron-ready rooms with reverent hushed tones. She'd been escorting a convoy of Afghan national forces when an ambush erupted from 3 directions simultaneously. Rocket-propelled grenades had bracketed her aircraft. Machine gun fire had stitched a line across her left wing. Most pilots would have called for backup and pulled out of range. Sarah had done the opposite. She descended into the fire, banking and weaving through the canyon like something alive and furious. Her cannon had torn through Taliban positions with such surgical precision and aggression that the ground commander had called her a Viper, beautiful, quick, and deadly as hell. The name stuck. That was 5 years ago. Since then, the legend had only grown. Ground crews stopped working when she walked past. Young pilots fresh out of training would literally follow her around, trying to absorb some ineffable quality of excellence. The Taliban had apparently named a bounty on her, $500,000 to anyone who could bring her down. She'd heard that rumor through intelligence channels, and it had made her laugh. Money couldn't buy the kind of luck she carried. She'd been hit 43 times in her previous aircraft. 43 times. No other A-10 pilot in active combat had survived more hits. No other pilot had maintained a 0 casualty rate among soldiers under their watch. That last part was what truly defined her. It wasn't the confirmed kills or the successful bombing runs or the miraculous escapes. It was the fact that not a single soldier had died while under her air support. In 6 years of combat flying, with hundreds of close air support missions, she'd maintained a perfect record. In Afghanistan, in a war where randomness and chaos often determined life and death, Sarah had imposed her will like gravity. When soldiers knew Viper was overhead, they knew they were coming home. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her shoulders every single day. She took another sip of cold coffee and grimaced. The sun hadn't risen yet, but the briefing was scheduled for 5:30. Today was marked as a routine patrol, Panjshir Valley, low-threat assessment, standard close air support availability. She'd flown this route 47 times before. She could do it in her sleep. That was both comforting and somehow terrifying. Routine was when mistakes happened. Routine was when people died because you weren't paying attention to something you'd seen 100 times before. Sarah had learned that lesson the hard way. Her first year, she'd lost 2 pilots in her squadron. Good men, excellent flyers. One had been killed by something he'd seen dozens of times and stopped really seeing. The other had been killed by something no one could have predicted. That was the cruelty of combat aviation. You had to maintain constant, desperate vigilance while acknowledging that sometimes no amount of skill or attention could matter. She'd learned to live with that paradox. Across the tarmac, her crew chief, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, was performing the pre-flight walk-around. At 52 years old, Rodriguez had been maintaining aircraft since before Sarah was born. He moved along the fuselage with the tenderness of a man examining a beloved child. His hands ran across the patches where bullets had punched through. He checked every rivet, every panel, every system. Rodriguez treated her aircraft like it was the most important thing in the world. In a way, it was. That aircraft would keep her alive today, or it wouldn't. There was rarely any middle ground. Sarah watched him work, this gray-haired man who'd somehow become the closest thing she had to a best friend. They'd never had a conversation deeper than aircraft maintenance, but there was understanding between them. Rodriguez had seen her plane come back with hydraulic fluid leaking, with pieces missing, with scorch marks from explosions that should have killed her. He had faith. It was the faith of a man who'd seen the impossible so many times that he'd stopped trying to understand it. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Lieutenant Marcus Webb approaching. Webb was her wingman, had been for 2 years now, and he was sharp. Not as sharp as her, but very few people were. He was 28, hungry, and he'd chosen to fly as her wing, specifically because flying with Viper meant learning from the best. He looked nervous, the way young pilots always did before a mission. "Morning, Viper," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Ready for another day in paradise." Sarah turned back to look at the aircraft. The sun was starting to bleed color across the eastern horizon. Pinks and golds were beginning to burn away the darkness. In another hour, that A-10 would be screaming down the runway. In another 90 minutes, she'd be over the valley, eyes sharp, mind focused, ready for whatever the day brought. "Paradise has an interesting definition," she replied quietly. She didn't smile. She rarely smiled anymore. "Let's get briefed. Intelligence said it's supposed to be light activity today." Webb nodded and fell into step beside her as they walked toward the operations building. Neither of them mentioned the statistic that both understood perfectly well. Light activity days were statistically the most dangerous. That's when you let your guard down. That's when you got careless. That's when people died. Sarah climbed the steps to the operations building, leaving the darkness behind, moving toward the fluorescent-lit room where her day would be determined. She had no idea that within 4 hours, her call sign would save 32 lives. She had no idea that her reputation, the legend she'd spent 6 years building, would prove more powerful than any weapon. All she knew was that it was time to fly, just another flight, or so she believed. The intelligence briefing had taken exactly 47 minutes. Sarah sat in the squadron-ready room, surrounded by the peculiar smell of military aviation, jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the sweat of anxious pilots. The briefing officer, a major from intelligence, had droned through satellite imagery, intercept reports, and threat assessments with the enthusiasm of a man reading a phone book. Panjshir Valley. Light to moderate Taliban activity. 2 possible IED sites marked on the map. 1 suspected weapons cache. Standard stuff. The kind of mission that could lull you into complacency if you weren't careful. Sarah had taken notes anyway, even though she'd already memorized the threat briefing. Every coordinate, every suspected enemy position, every grid reference. Her notebook was already dog-eared and marked with annotations in her precise, controlled handwriting. To the left, Marcus Webb took notes with less intensity, occasionally glancing sideways at his flight lead like a student watching the teacher. He was good, Webb was, but he didn't have the obsessive attention to detail that separated good pilots from legendary ones. By the time the briefing ended, the sun had fully cleared the horizon. The pre-dawn darkness had transformed into bright morning light that made everything look both more real and somehow more fragile. Sarah and Webb walked across the tarmac toward the flight line, their flight suits creating a rhythmic whisper against their bodies. The morning air was already warming. It would be brutal by midday, the kind of heat that made the Afghan summer feel like flying through the surface of another planet. "You seem quiet today," Webb said as they approached the aircraft. His tone was light, conversational, but Sarah could hear the underlying tension. "More than usual, I mean." "Just thinking," Sarah replied. She stopped in front of her A-10, placing her hand on the fuselage. The metal was already warm from the rising sun. The intelligence briefing felt incomplete. That major didn't seem confident about his threat assessment. "Light activity," Webb shrugged. "Maybe it actually is a quiet day." Sarah didn't respond. Quiet days were a fiction. In 6 years of combat flying, she'd learned that the most dangerous missions were the ones that felt routine, that seemed manageable, that lulled you into believing that today would be just like yesterday. She'd seen too many body bags marked with names of pilots who died on quiet days. The crew chief, Rodriguez, appeared with the pre-flight checklist. He had a stoic expression, but Sarah could read him like a book. Something about today bothered him too. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just the accumulated anxiety of 6 years of watching the same pilot fly into danger and somehow always come back. Aircraft is green across the board, Rodriguez reported, handing her the maintenance logs. All systems nominal. We replaced the number 2 hydraulic pump yesterday, and I've run it through hot tests 3 times. Confidence level is high. Sarah nodded, reviewing the logs with careful attention. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was one of the most reliable aircraft in the military, designed to keep flying even when it had no right to. It had been built in the 1970s with a simple mission statement: keep ground troops alive. Every design decision had been made with that single purpose in mind. It was slow, which meant it could stay on station longer. It was armored, which meant it could survive hits that would vaporize other aircraft. It had the GAU-8 Avenger cannon, a weapon so powerful that it could destroy tanks. In Sarah's hands, it became something more, a tool of salvation. "Looking good, Rodriguez," she said, handing the logs back. "Make sure the crew runs one final systems check before we crank." "Already done, ma'am," Rodriguez replied with the faintest hint of a smile. He'd been doing this job for over 2 decades. He knew better than to do anything less than perfect. Sarah and Webb completed their walk-around inspection, a ritual that never changed, that every pilot performed the same way because deviations from ritual sometimes meant missing critical problems. Sarah ran her hands across the wing, feeling for damage. She checked the cannon ammunition bay, verified that the Hellfire missiles were properly seated in their hardpoints, confirmed that every external store was secure. By the time they finished, sweat was already running down her back despite the early hour. At 5:47, Sarah climbed into the cockpit. The smell hit her immediately, that mixture of leather, electronics, and something indefinably military. Her hands moved through the startup sequence with practiced precision. The ejection seat was armed, harnesses were locked, canopy was closed. Around her, the cockpit displays began to light up like Christmas morning. Engine startup parameters appeared on the screens. Fuel quantity indicators blinked to life. The targeting pod initialized with a soft beeping sound that most pilots never really heard after their first 100 flights. She keyed the radio. "Bagram Tower, Viper Flight of 2, requesting startup clearance." The response came back immediately. "Viper Flight, you are cleared for startup. Wind 090 at 8 knots. QNH 2990. Sarah acknowledged and continued the startup sequence. The left engine began its whining ascent to operational RPM. The right engine followed. The distinctive high-pitched scream of the General Electric turbofans filled the cockpit, a sound that most civilians would find terrifying, but that Sarah found oddly comforting. It was the sound of power. It was the sound of purpose. Webb's voice came through the radio as his aircraft came to life beside hers. "Viper 2, ready for taxi." "Copy that too," Sarah replied. She released the parking brakes and felt the aircraft begin to move. The A-10 was heavy, over 50,000 pounds fully loaded, but it moved with surprising grace under her control. She guided the aircraft toward the taxiway, watching the wingtip clearance, conscious of the fact that Rodriguez was watching from below, making sure his aircraft made it safely to the runway. They taxied in silence, following the marked route across the airfield. Ground personnel stopped work to watch them pass. A young airman actually saluted. Sarah didn't acknowledge it. The moment for personal recognition was past. She was in the zone now, the place where consciousness narrowed down to nothing but the mission ahead. At the runway threshold, Sarah ran through her final checks. Trim set correctly. Flight controls responsive, hydraulic systems nominal, fuel management configured for high-altitude cruise, weapons systems armed and ready, everything checked out, everything was perfect. She keyed the radio one final time. Bagram Tower, Viper Flight requesting takeoff clearance on runway 3. Viper Flight, you are cleared for takeoff. Runway 3, wind 090 at 7 knots. Sarah advanced the throttle smoothly. The engines responded immediately, the roar building from a scream to something almost beyond human hearing. The brakes released. The aircraft surged forward with increasing violence. The runway blurred. G-forces pressed her into the ejection seat. And then, at exactly 132 knots, the nose wheel lifted, followed by the main gear. At 6:03 hours, the aircraft was airborne. The world fell away beneath her. Afghanistan spread out in all its harsh, beautiful complexity. Mountains rose like ancient teeth. Valleys cut through the landscape like scars. And somewhere below, in a canyon Sarah couldn't yet see, lives were about to change forever, though she had no way of knowing that yet. She climbed toward 8,000 feet, her wingman perfect in formation beside her. The radio crackled with routine traffic. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Just another flight. The morning patrol was textbook routine. Sarah and Webb had reached their assigned altitude of 15,000 feet and were now cruising northwest toward the Panjshir Valley at 280 knots. The Afghan landscape sprawled beneath them in all its harsh, unforgiving beauty. Snow-capped peaks stretched toward the horizon like the spines of sleeping giants. Deep valleys carved through the mountains, their shadows so dark they looked like wounds in the earth. From this altitude, the country looked almost peaceful, almost like a place where war hadn't claimed thousands of lives. Sarah knew better. War wasn't visible from 15,000 feet. It lived in the shadows, in the canyon floors, in the minds of men who'd learned to kill before they learned to read. Viper Flight, check in, she transmitted, maintaining the radio discipline that had become second nature over 6 years of combat. Viper 2, systems nominal, all green across the board, Webb responded immediately. His voice was calm, professional, with the slight undertone of controlled adrenaline that every pilot carried. Even on routine missions, you couldn't entirely suppress it. Copy 2. Let's move northeast into the valley. Intelligence noted possible activity near grid reference Foxtrot 903, coordinates 27 uniform. Viper 2 copies, heading northeast. Sarah banked the aircraft smoothly, Webb maintaining perfect formation position off her right wing. The A-10 wasn't the fastest aircraft in the military. It would lose a race to most commercial airliners. But that was the point. Slow and steady meant longer time on station, better visibility, better weapons employment. It meant she could see things other aircraft missed. The canyon walls began rising as they descended toward 8,000 feet. Sarah's eyes scanned the terrain constantly, looking for the telltale signs of enemy activity. Vehicle tracks, dismounted personnel, weapons caches. Taliban fighters didn't always try to hide. Sometimes they were bold. Sometimes they wanted to be seen. Those were the dangerous ones, the ones with nothing left to lose. The radio had been quiet except for routine check-ins. That was almost suspicious in itself. Usually there was more chatter. Ground forces requesting support, other aircraft coordinating, air traffic control managing the airspace. But this morning felt empty, hollow, like the world was holding its breath. Sarah checked her fuel state, 4,200 pounds remaining, enough for another hour and a half of patrol before she'd need to consider RTB, return to base. She noted the time, 6:41 hours. The briefing had mentioned possible activity in this sector, but so far nothing had materialized. The Taliban's summer offensive was ongoing across the country, but apparently not here. Not now. She was thinking about adjusting their patrol route when the radio exploded. Contact, contact, we're taking fire. Multiple contacts, multiple RPG impacts. The transmission was fractured, panicked, drowning in static and background noise. Sarah's entire body went rigid. That was a ground unit, a real unit, under fire, right now. Say call sign. Say grid reference, Sarah transmitted, her voice cutting through the chaos with crystalline clarity. Years of training meant her voice never betrayed the spike of adrenaline that just flooded her system. This is Hammer 2-1 convoy out of Bagram. We're in a canyon, we're pinned down. The voice belonged to someone trying very hard not to panic and failing. Multiple muzzle flashes, we have casualties, we need immediate air support. Sarah's mind was already working 3 steps ahead. The briefing hadn't mentioned any convoys operating in this sector, but the intelligence briefing had been incomplete. She'd known that from the start. Convoys got rerouted, plans changed, and right now, somewhere in the maze of canyons below, American soldiers or Afghan national forces were dying. Viper 2, you copy that, Sarah said calmly. Copy lead. I'm ready to move, Webb responded, his training overriding any hesitation. Roger that. Hammer 2-1, this is Viper flight. We are 2 A-10s, 8 minutes out from your position. We need grid reference and mark your location. Throw smoke if you have it. Viper Hammer 2-1 grid reference is. There was a pause, then frantic transmission. 27 Uniform 774788. We're the friendlies. Friendlies with red smoke. Enemy is from the north and east. Sarah was already punching the coordinates into her navigation system. Her hands moved with absolute precision. No wasted motion. No hesitation. This was what she trained for. This was the moment that separated routine from reality. The radio was exploding with crosstalk now. Hammer 2-1 was calling repeatedly. Other units were trying to get traffic. Air traffic control at Bagram was trying to coordinate. And through it all, Sarah could hear the unmistakable sound of gunfire in the background of Hammer 2-1's transmissions. The distinctive crackle of AK-47 fire mixed with the heavier boom of machine guns. Viper 2, we're going combat spread, Sarah announced. I'm descending to 6,000 feet to close on the contact. You stay at current altitude and provide overwatch. If you see SAMs or AAA, you let me know immediately. Copy that lead, breaking right to establish overwatch position. Sarah banked her aircraft aggressively, the G-forces pressing her into her seat. She shoved the nose down, trading altitude for speed. The terrain below was rushing up toward her. Canyons were appearing, deep, narrow slots between the mountains where the sky was just a strip of blue overhead. She checked her tactical display. The contact was 3 kilometers away, maybe 2 minutes of flight time. Hammer 2-1, Viper flight is inbound, 2 minutes out. We have your location. Friendlies mark your position with smoke if possible. Enemy to your north and east. Acknowledge. Viper Hammer 2-1 acknowledges. We're marking position now. Oh God, we have multiple KIA, multiple WIA. Soldier is bleeding out, we need. The transmission cut to static. Not deliberately cut off. Just the normal fade that happened in mountainous terrain when radio signals bounced oddly off rock walls. Sarah's jaw clenched. Someone was dying down there right now, while she was flying toward them. The pressure of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like a physical weight. She'd felt it before dozens of times, but it never got easier. Every soldier on the ground was someone's brother, someone's father, someone's son. Every casualty was a failure, even when there was no logical way it could have been prevented. She pushed the thought aside. Emotions were a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Focus, precision, aggression, those were the tools that saved lives. Viper 2, I'm descending into the canyon. I see the valley, looking for smoke. Webb's voice came back steady. Copy lead. I have you visual in the canyon. I'm at 8,000 feet maintaining overwatch. I see muzzle flashes from approximately 1 click north of your position. Multiple positions. There, Sarah saw it. The faint wisps of red smoke rising from the canyon floor. Soldiers were down there, desperate, bleeding, counting on her to bring salvation from the sky. The radio had been quiet for 20 seconds, an eternity in combat. The silence was worse than the screaming had been. Sarah armed her weapon systems. The cannon was hot. The missiles were ready. She was 30 seconds away from the target. Hammer 2-1, Viper is inbound 30 seconds. Get your head down. We are weapons hot. Say enemy positions relative to your smoke. The response came back weak but clear. Enemy 1 click north, enemy positions east. Viper, thank God you're here. Sarah didn't respond. She was focused entirely on the tactical problem in front of her. Enemy positions to the north and east. Friendlies marked with red smoke. Canyon terrain limiting her approach angles. She calculated approach vectors, timing, ordnance selection. The GAU-8 was her primary weapon. 1,174 rounds of devastating 30mm firepower that could chew through just about anything. The canyon walls were rising rapidly. She was descending through 4,000 feet now, the aircraft responding to every input with mechanical perfection. She could see the smoke now, bright red against the brown canyon walls, and she could see the muzzle flashes too, multiple positions. The enemy was well positioned, using the terrain to their advantage. It wouldn't matter. Sarah set up her attack run with surgical precision. This was what she lived for. This was why the legend existed. Viper 2, I'm rolling in hot, she transmitted. The response came back immediately. Copy that, Viper. You are cleared. All friendlies are in the southern portion of the canyon. Watch the ridge to your east. I see movement up there. Sarah didn't acknowledge. She was committed now. The moment of decision had passed. There was only execution. She brought the nose of her aircraft around, lining up the first pass. The targeting pod locked onto a cluster of muzzle flashes. The numbers on her HUD calculated range, lead angle, and impact point. Everything aligned. She keyed the radio one final time. Vipers in hot. Those 3 words hung in the static, heavy with promise. The nose of Sarah's A-10 dropped toward the canyon floor. She was descending at nearly 250 knots, the aircraft singing a high-pitched scream as she pushed throttles forward and deployed the combat flaps. The altimeter unwound rapidly. 3,500 feet, 3,200 feet, 2,800 feet. The canyon walls rose on either side of her like the jaws of some ancient beast, ready to snap shut on anything foolish enough to descend into its depths. Sarah had flown this kind of attack 100 times, maybe more. The repetition didn't make it safer. It just meant she knew exactly how many ways this particular maneuver could kill her. Her targeting pod was locked onto the first enemy position. The heads-up display showed the target location, the range, the lead angle, all the mathematical calculations that turned flying into warfare. She was nose-on to the enemy position, which meant they could see her coming. That was the point. Speed and surprise were luxuries she didn't have in the canyon. Instead, she had armor, redundancy, and the absolute certainty that her weapons were superior. The threat warning system started screaming. Viper, you're getting painted. Webb's voice cut through the radio, urgent but controlled. Multiple radar sources looks like. Shilka radar, infrared tracking devices. Sarah acknowledged the warning with a single grunt. The Shilka was a Soviet-era self-propelled anti-aircraft gun, essentially a tracked vehicle with 4 23mm cannons and a radar guidance system. It was dangerous. It could shred her aircraft if she wasn't careful. But it was also slow to traverse, and the canyon geometry worked in her favor. The narrow walls meant the Shilka couldn't track her effectively on approach. At 2,200 feet altitude, the first tracer rounds erupted from the canyon floor. They came from the north, the position that Webb had warned her about. Brilliant orange streaks that seemed to move almost slowly, defying the laws of physics with their apparent leisurely pace. That was an optical illusion. Those rounds were moving at nearly 1,000 meters per second. What made them seem slow was the forward velocity of the aircraft. Closing speed was making the relative motion distort in her brain. Sarah's jaw clenched. She was committed now. Pulling out meant the enemy owned the airspace. Pulling out meant those soldiers would die. She didn't pull out. The first rounds missed, passing behind her aircraft, but more were coming. The enemy had multiple firing positions. She could see the flashes now. At least 3 distinct positions along the ridge to her right. They were professional, or they were lucky, or they were desperate. Probably a combination of all 3. Sarah was 1,500 feet above ground level now, close enough to see individual rocks on the canyon walls, close enough that her depth perception was crystal clear. The ground below was a blur of tan and brown, with green vegetation marking the sparse water sources, and there, bright red smoke marking the friendly position. The soldiers were huddled in the southern portion of the canyon, in what appeared to be a dried riverbed that offered some cover from the fire raining down on them. Another burst of tracer fire, this time from the eastern position. These rounds were closer. She felt the familiar jolt as at least one round impacted her fuselage. The sound was like an angry fist punching through aluminum. The A-10s titanium bathtub protected the cockpit, but the wings and engines were vulnerable. She felt the asymmetrical drag immediately. Her right engine had taken a hit. Still functioning, but damaged. Webb's voice came through again. "Viper, I see impacts on your right wing. You're still flyable. Repeat, you're still flyable." Sarah didn't respond. She was in pure tactical mode now, all conscious thought subordinated to the mission. The targeting pod showed her the impact points of enemy fire. She could see the Taliban positions with crystal clarity now. 3 main positions along the ridge. At least one more to the east, partially concealed in a rocky outcrop. They were coordinated, which meant they had communication, which meant they had command structure. At 1,000 feet, Sarah triggered the GAU-8 Avenger cannon. The aircraft shuddered violently. The sound was indescribable, like tearing fabric mixed with thunder mixed with the roar of a jet engine grinding metal. The cannon fired at a rate of 3,900 rounds per minute, which meant in the space of a single 2-second burst, she'd released over 130 rounds of devastating 30mm ammunition. The recoil was so violent that it actually slowed her forward airspeed slightly. The A-10 had been designed around the GAU-8. The aircraft existed primarily to carry this gun. The gun dictated the aircraft's design, not the other way around. The results were immediate and catastrophic. The enemy position she'd targeted erupted. Rocky outcrops disintegrated. A Taliban fighter who'd been manning a PKM machine gun simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the kinetic energy of 3 30mm rounds hitting the space where he'd been standing. The second burst caught the secondary position. Muzzle flashes disappeared. Return fire slackened. But the enemy wasn't broken, not yet. More tracer fire erupted from the eastern position. These rounds were coming from a different weapon, heavier, slower, but more powerful. The Taliban had dragged out the heavy guns. Machine guns, maybe an NSV or a DSHK. The rounds were enormous, each one the size of a small soda bottle, traveling at velocities that meant if one hit the right place on her aircraft, she'd be ejecting into hostile territory. Sarah banked hard to the right, the G-forces slamming her into her seat. Her vision narrowed slightly, a sign that she was pulling multiple GS, stressing the aircraft and her body simultaneously. The targeting pod followed her movement, maintaining lock on the eastern position. She could hear the wind screaming through the damaged sections of her fuselage. The aircraft was hurt but still flying, still fighting. At 800 feet, she came around for a second attack run. Webb's voice was urgent now. "Viper, you're trailing hydraulic fluid. Estimate you've got limited flight time before handling becomes degraded." Sarah acknowledged with another grunt. She knew the limitations of her aircraft better than anyone alive. The hydraulic fluid loss was a problem, but it wasn't critical yet. The A-10 had redundant hydraulic systems. 3 separate lines, so if one was damaged, the others would compensate. For a while, anyway. The second attack run was even more aggressive than the first. Sarah positioned herself for the perfect gun pass, lining up on the heaviest concentration of muzzle flashes. The cannon came alive again. The recoil shoved her backward in her seat. 30 rounds, 40 rounds, 50 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition downrange. Each round weighed about 270 grams and traveled at nearly 1,000 meters per second. The eastern position was obliterated. But Sarah wasn't done. A third position, one she'd identified only moments ago, opened fire with what sounded like an RPK or PKM. The rounds were wild, desperate, the fire of someone who knew they were about to die. Sarah brought the nose around for a third attack run, but this time something went wrong. The aircraft lurched violently to the right. For an instant, Sarah thought she'd been hit catastrophically, but then her training kicked in. She immediately identified the problem. Her right engine was failing. The earlier hit had damaged something critical. The engine was still producing power, but it was unstable, creating differential thrust that was trying to force her aircraft into a spin. She reduced power on the damaged engine, increased power on the left engine, and fought the aircraft straight. For a moment, just a moment, she wasn't sure she'd make it. The canyon walls seemed to rush toward her. The ground seemed impossibly close. Then the aircraft responded. The handling stabilized. Sarah was at 600 feet now, trailing hydraulic fluid and fuel, flying on one good engine and one damaged engine, with the throttle in her hand and 1,000 Taliban fighters on the ground trying to kill her. She should have ejected. She should have climbed out and gotten to safe altitude. Instead, Sarah triggered the GAU-8 one more time. The cannon roared. The third Taliban position erupted into chaos. Return fire ceased. For a moment, there was silence. Then in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Sarah's aircraft was climbing now, limping away from the canyon at 400 feet altitude. The damaged right engine was producing an ominous whine that suggested it wouldn't last much longer. Hydraulic fluid was still leaking. She could see the trail of mist behind her wing. But she was alive. And more importantly, the immediate threat to the convoy had been neutralized. Or at least it should have been. The radio had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of mission accomplished, but an eerie, expectant silence. The ground unit, Hammer 2-1, hadn't transmitted in nearly 2 minutes. The enemy fire had stopped completely about 90 seconds ago, which was strange. The Taliban didn't usually just give up. They didn't typically break contact after taking casualties. They fought until they were physically unable to continue, or until they achieved their objective. Breaking contact wasn't part of their playbook. Sarah was about to call for a status update when the radio crackled. "Viper, Viper, is that you?" The voice that came through was barely audible beneath the static and background noise. It sounded like someone speaking through emotion so thick it was nearly choking him. "Viper, is that actually you?" Sarah's hand froze on the throttle. Something in that voice triggered a memory, a fragment from years ago, but the voice was different now. Older, harder, broken. "Hammer 2-1, this is Viper," she transmitted, keeping her voice professional and neutral. "Status report. How many casualties do you have?" There was a pause, a long pause, the kind of pause that suggested the person on the radio was struggling to maintain composure. "Viper, this is Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, Hammer 2-1 actual. Do you remember me?" Recognition hit Sarah like a physical blow. 3 years ago, a different valley, a different ambush, a young staff sergeant commanding a unit of Afghan National Forces who'd been caught in crossfire with no air support available for 6 critical minutes. Sarah had responded to their distress call even though it meant deviating from her assigned patrol area. She'd come in guns blazing and pulled 32 soldiers from what should have been a massacre. Mitchell had been the commander then too. A younger Mitchell, but the voice was unmistakable once you knew what you were listening for. "Mitchell," Sarah transmitted. "I remember, status report, how many casualties?" But even as she asked, something strange was happening in the canyon below. The radio traffic from the Taliban positions, which had been continuous throughout the engagement, had stopped. Not gradually tapered off. Stopped. The chatter, the commands, the coordination that she'd been hearing through her threat detection systems all went silent. It was like someone had flipped a switch. Webb's voice came through her headset. "Viper Lead, I'm noticing something weird down there. Enemy positions are consolidating. They're moving. I see personnel pulling back from the northern ridge. They're retreating. Repeat, enemy is breaking contact and retreating." Sarah's mind raced through tactical possibilities. Had her cannon runs been more devastating than she realized? Had she killed the command structure? Had the enemy decided to cut losses and withdraw to fight another day? All possible, all logical. But that wasn't what was happening. Mitchell's voice came through again, and this time it was shaking. "Viper, your call sign. When they heard your call sign, when we told them Viper was inbound, something changed. The fire didn't stop immediately, but I could feel it. I could feel them losing their will to fight. And then when you made that last gun run, that's when they broke." Sarah felt her chest tighten. Mitchell, negative. The enemy broke contact because of effective weapons employment. They took casualties. They lost. Viper, no. Mitchell's interruption was firm, insistent. "Ma'am, with respect, you need to understand what just happened. Before you arrived, we were losing. We had 3 soldiers critically wounded. We were pinned down and we had maybe 5 minutes of ammunition left before we were overrun. 5 minutes. That's all we had. And then we heard your call sign on the radio." Sarah didn't respond. She was listening now, really listening. Mitchell continued, his voice steadier now but still carrying the weight of what he'd just experienced. Word spread through those Taliban fighters like some kind of ghost story. They started asking each other, "Is that Viper, the Viper?" I heard them through our intercepts. "Ma'am, you've killed so many of their fighters that your name is literally frightening them. You're a legend to them, a legend of death." The canyon was scrolling past beneath her now. She could see the abandoned Taliban positions. Taliban fighters were indeed pulling back, moving away from the contact zone. Some were moving quickly. Some were moving slowly, as if reluctant to break contact. But they were all moving, all retreating. "When they confirmed it was actually you," Mitchell continued, "when they realized Viper was coming, something broke inside them. The fear was stronger than the discipline, stronger than the command structure. I've been a soldier for 16 years, ma'am. I've seen combat in 3 different countries. I've never seen anything like what happened in the last 60 seconds. They literally stopped fighting because they were terrified of you." Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she didn't have a name for. It wasn't pride. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something darker and more complex. The realization that her reputation had evolved beyond what she'd ever intended. She'd become a weapon that killed with more than bullets. "Mitchell, I'm still inbound for medical evacuation support," Sarah transmitted, pushing the personal reaction aside. "How many WIA do you have? What's the severity?" 3 soldiers, Mitchell replied. "One is critical gunshot wound to the abdomen, significant blood loss, but he's stable for now. The other 2 are non-critical. Ma'am, if you hadn't come when you did, if those Taliban fighters hadn't broken, we'd all be dead, all of us." Sarah's radio crackled with Webb's voice. "Viper Lead, I have visual on the friendly position. Can confirm 3 personnel down. Personnel are providing medical treatment. Enemy positions are continuing to withdraw. Estimate they're 2 kilometers out now and moving faster." Sarah acknowledged and began a climbing turn to establish an orbit above the canyon. Her right engine was still producing concerning sounds, but it was holding together. For now, that was enough. The canyon below was transformed. What had been a killing zone minutes ago was now a place where American and Afghan soldiers were treating their wounded. They'd survived. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, they'd survived. And not because Sarah had demonstrated superior tactics or perfect execution, though she'd done both. They'd survived because her name meant something. Because in the minds of Taliban fighters, Viper wasn't just a pilot, Viper was a promise of death. Viper was a guarantee that if she was coming, your position was compromised. Your mission was over. Your life was in danger. Sarah had spent 6 years building a reputation through skill and courage. But somewhere along the way, that reputation had become a weapon in itself. A psychological weapon that was every bit as devastating as her cannon. She didn't know how to feel about that. Below, Mitchell was setting up a security perimeter around the wounded. His soldiers were checking weapons and watching the ridges, making sure the enemy's retreat wasn't just a tactical repositioning. But Sarah could hear the relief in the background chatter. The soldiers knew they'd been saved. They knew they were going home. "Viper," Mitchell transmitted, his voice steady now. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved us. You saved everything." Sarah was about to respond when she felt the right engine cough. Just once, but it was a warning sign. The damaged engine was deteriorating. She had maybe 5 more minutes before it would start producing so much vibration and thrust imbalance that flying would become genuinely dangerous. Hammer 2-1, prepare for medevac helicopter arrival in approximately 12 minutes, Sarah transmitted. Maintain security and have your wounded ready for transport. As she orbited above the canyon, Sarah looked down at the soldiers she'd saved. She thought about Mitchell's words, about how her name alone had changed the outcome of a battle, about how reputation had become more powerful than weapons. And she understood, finally, what the true cost of being Viper had become. The Taliban's retreat was beginning to accelerate. Sarah could see it from her orbiting position, groups of fighters moving away from the canyon with increasing speed. They were alive to the fact that the psychological advantage they'd briefly possessed had evaporated. The moment of breaking was passing. If they regrouped, if they found new positions, if they rallied under a different commander, the battle could restart. Sarah wasn't about to let that happen. "Viper 2, I'm going to keep them off balance," Sarah transmitted to Webb. "I want you to maintain overwatch and call out any movement that looks like they're setting up new positions. If they try to regroup, I'm going to remind them why they were running in the first place." "Copy that lead," Webb responded. "I'm watching the eastern ridge and the northern approach. I'll keep you informed of all movement." Sarah reduced her orbit radius, bringing her damaged aircraft lower over the canyon. The right engine was producing a distinctive vibration now, not severe, but noticeable. Every moment she flew added risk to the airframe. But she had maybe 10 minutes before the medevac helicopters arrived, and she was going to use every second of that time to ensure the enemy understood that running was the only logical choice. She spotted the first group of Taliban fighters attempting to establish a new position approximately 2 kilometers northeast of the original contact area. They were moving into a rocky outcrop that offered decent cover and good fields of fire back toward the canyon. Professional positioning. Disciplined approach. It was exactly what a competent military unit would do. Exactly what a unit would do if the legendary Viper wasn't about to remind them why discipline and professionalism meant nothing against superior firepower. 2. I've got movement northeast, approximately 2 clicks from friendly position. Looks like they're setting up for a counter-ambush, Sarah called out. "I see them," Webb confirmed. "Multiple personnel, maybe 30 to 40 fighters. They're consolidating weapons and ammunition. Looks like they're preparing for sustained fire." That was all Sarah needed to hear. She banked her damaged aircraft toward the new threat, establishing a gun-run approach vector. The right engine coughed again, more pronounced this time. Sarah made a mental note: 2 more gun runs, maybe 3 if she was lucky. After that, the engine would likely fail entirely, and she'd be flying on one turbofan with a damaged hydraulic system in a canyon where any engine failure was potentially catastrophic. But she wasn't going to waste those opportunities on anything less than decisive action. At 3,500 feet altitude, Sarah armed the GAU-8 cannon and began her descent. The Taliban fighters on the ground saw her coming. They had to know what was about to happen. Sarah's previous gun runs had killed dozens of their fighters. The evidence was all around them: scorched earth, destroyed positions, blood-soaked rocks. They knew what Viper's arrival meant. But they didn't run, or at least not all of them did. Some stayed in position. Some began firing at her incoming aircraft. It was a futile gesture, small arms fire against an aircraft designed specifically to survive this kind of punishment, but it was also a sign of defiance. These fighters had decided that standing and fighting, even against overwhelming odds, was preferable to running. Sarah respected that, even as she prepared to vaporize them. The first rounds impacted her fuselage at approximately 2,800 feet altitude. Sarah felt the jolts through the airframe. Her threat warning system was screaming. The tactical display showed multiple firing positions. She didn't hesitate. At 2,500 feet, with the Taliban position filling her windscreen, Sarah triggered the GAU-8. The recoil was violent and immediate. The aircraft shuddered as thousands of rounds of 30mm ammunition poured downrange. The cannon fired in controlled bursts, 2 seconds, pause, 2 seconds, pause, each burst delivering 130 rounds of kinetic devastation. The Taliban position wasn't just suppressed, it was obliterated. Rocks disintegrated. Weapons emplacements disappeared. Taliban fighters who'd been positioning for an ambush were transformed into casualties by the overwhelming firepower. The sound was apocalyptic, the signature roar of the GAU-8 mixing with explosions and the screams of dying men. Sarah pulled up hard, the G-forces slamming her into her seat as she climbed back to a safer altitude. Her left arm was already burning from the stress of the maneuver. The right engine was now making a sound like marbles in a blender, a dangerous sign that bearing failure was imminent. "Lead, I confirm target is destroyed," Webb called out. "No return fire. Multiple KIA, estimated 30-plus Taliban fighters. They're not reconstituting. I see scattered personnel moving away from the position at high speed." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was checking her fuel state and engine parameters. Fuel, 2,400 pounds remaining. Right engine temperature, critically high. Right engine vibration, severe. She had maybe one more gun run before she'd need to seriously consider climbing to altitude for the helicopter arrival. She spotted the second regrouping position almost immediately. This one was smaller, maybe 15 to 20 fighters, attempting to establish a fallback position about a kilometer away from the first. They were moving deliberately, cautiously, and when they saw her aircraft banking toward them, panic visibly rippled through their unit. Some scattered immediately, others stood their ground. Sarah came around for her second attack run, this one more aggressive than the first. She was lower this time, 800 feet, which meant the Taliban had less time to track and engage her. But it also meant less altitude to recover from if something went catastrophically wrong. The tracer fire started at 1,600 feet. The Taliban fighters had learned nothing from the previous destruction, or perhaps they'd learned everything and had simply decided that some fights had to be fought regardless of the odds. Sarah's training didn't care about their reasoning. Her training only cared about the tactical problem: neutralize the threat. She triggered the cannon and held the trigger longer this time. 5 seconds of sustained fire. Nearly 330 rounds of 30mm ammunition downrange in a single, devastating stream. The effect was like watching a surgical knife cut through tissue, precise, efficient, and absolutely lethal. The second Taliban position collapsed before the last round left the barrel. When Sarah pulled up this time, her right engine was making sounds that suggested it didn't have much time left. She was at 1,200 feet altitude, covered in sweat. her breath coming in sharp gasps beneath her oxygen mask. The adrenaline was peaking now, that extraordinary mental clarity that came from operating at the absolute edge of human capability. Below, the canyon had transformed. What had been a zone of active combat 30 minutes ago was now a graveyard. Bodies were scattered across two major sites. Weapons were destroyed or abandoned. Equipment was burning. And the surviving Taliban fighters were running, actually fleeing in panic, abandoning wounded comrades and equipment. Mitchell's voice came through the radio, and it was unmistakably shaking with relief and something approaching awe. "Viper, I don't know what just happened down there, but I'm looking at enemy positions being abandoned across the entire area. They're running. They're actually running." "Confirm no return fire from any position," Sarah transmitted, her voice steady despite the physical stress her body was enduring. "Negative, no return fire. Viper, you've cleared the entire valley. It's done. It's actually done." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was concentrating on flying the damaged aircraft, on maintaining altitude and heading while the right engine continued its alarming deterioration. Webb was still providing overwatch, still scanning for any sign of Taliban regrouping. But there wouldn't be any. The enemy had broken completely. The name Viper, combined with the demonstrated firepower, had proven too much for them to overcome. Sarah climbed to 5,000 feet and began orbiting the canyon. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors approaching. The medevac birds were inbound. The soldiers below would be evacuated. The wounded would be treated. The battle would be over. Sarah looked down at the canyon floor, at the soldiers who'd been saved not just by her weapons but by her reputation. And she understood that Mitchell had been right. Her call sign had changed everything. The Taliban had been broken not by superior firepower alone, but by the psychological impact of knowing that Viper was coming. She'd become something more than a pilot. She'd become a guarantee, a promise written in tracer fire and cannon rounds. And somewhere deep inside, Sarah wasn't sure if that was something to be proud of or terrified of. The medevac helicopters arrived at exactly 07:43 hours. Sarah watched from her orbiting position as the Army Black Hawks descended into the canyon with practiced precision. The rotor wash kicked up dust and debris, but the pilots handled the approach flawlessly. On the ground, Mitchell's soldiers were moving with the efficiency of trained personnel. The 3 wounded were being loaded onto stretchers. Security was being maintained around the landing zone. Everything was executing exactly as it should. Sarah's relief at seeing the helicopters arrive safely was immediately tempered by the realization that her right engine was deteriorating faster than she'd anticipated. The vibration had become so severe that she could feel it throughout the airframe. The engine temperature gauge was in the red zone. The pressure readings were dropping. She had maybe 5 minutes before the engine would suffer a catastrophic failure. "Viper 2, I need you to know that my right engine is failing," Sarah transmitted to Webb, keeping her voice level and professional. "I'm going to start climbing toward Bagram now. If this engine flames out, I want maximum altitude to work with." "Copy that lead," Webb responded immediately. "I'm positioning to provide visual escort. If you need to eject, I'll have your 6. Sarah acknowledged and began a gentle climb out of the canyon. The transition from the narrow confines of the valley to open airspace felt like surfacing from underwater. The world expanded. Options appeared. Height became her friend again instead of her enemy. The medevac helicopters were lifting off now, their rotor blades churning the air with desperate energy. Sarah watched them climb, watched them establish their course toward the forward operating base at Jalalabad. The wounded soldiers were getting medical care. The mission was accomplished. All that remained was getting herself and her damaged aircraft back to Bagram. At 6,000 feet, the right engine finally began its death throes. The vibration became so severe that Sarah's vision actually blurred. Instruments were rattling in their mounts. The airframe was groaning under stress it was never designed to endure. She immediately advanced the throttle on the left engine to compensate for the loss of thrust on the right side. The aircraft responded, but sluggishly. She was fighting an asymmetrical power situation that was becoming increasingly dangerous. 2. I've got total engine failure on the right side, Sarah transmitted, working to keep the tremor out of her voice. I'm going to nurse it back to Bagram on the single engine. It's going to be slow and ugly, but it'll work. Copy that lead. I'm right here with you. How's your hydraulic situation? Sarah quickly scanned her instruments. The hydraulic pressure on the backup system had dropped significantly during the combat maneuvers. The primary system had failed earlier, which meant she was operating on a single hydraulic line now. If that line was compromised further, she'd lose flight control authority. Hydraulic pressure is holding steady on backup, she reported. It's not ideal, but it's workable. I'm going to take it slow and easy. No aggressive maneuvers. The flight back to Bagram would normally take about 20 minutes at cruise altitude. With a single engine and damaged hydraulics, it was going to take closer to 35 minutes. 35 minutes of nursing a crippled aircraft through the Afghan airspace, praying that nothing else failed, that no other systems suffered catastrophic damage, that the single engine continued to produce enough thrust to maintain altitude. It was going to be the longest 35 minutes of her life. Sarah settled into a steady climb toward 10,000 feet. The left engine was carrying the entire load now, power that it was never designed to produce alone. The turbofan was screaming in protest, running at nearly 95% of maximum safe operating parameters. If she pushed it any harder, she risked mechanical failure. If she didn't push it hard enough, she'd lose altitude and potentially find herself unable to clear the terrain ahead. It was a narrow path to walk. Webb maintained perfect formation position off her right wing, staying close enough to provide visual escort but not so close that his wingtip could clip her damaged fuselage. The gesture was typically military: 2 aircraft, 1 pilot, committed to bringing both planes home. It was what you did for your wingman. It was what you did for people you trusted. Lead Bagram Tower has you on radar, Webb reported. They're clearing the airspace for your approach. They know you're damaged. They're going to have emergency equipment standing by. Good copy, Sarah acknowledged. She could see Bagram in the distance now, a collection of buildings and runways sprawled across the dusty Afghan plain. It had never looked so good. Her aircraft was holding altitude at 8,000 feet, but the climb rate was dropping. The single engine was producing barely enough thrust to maintain level flight, let alone continue climbing. Sarah made a decision. She was going to maintain 8,000 feet and start her approach descent early. It would give her more time to nurse the aircraft in, more opportunity to solve problems that might arise, more distance to glide if the last engine decided to fail completely. Bagram Tower, Viper 1, I'm descending into approach now, she transmitted. I have battle damage, right engine complete loss, primary hydraulic system failure, backup hydraulic pressure degraded. I need long approach, reduced descent rate, and emergency equipment standing by. The response came back immediately, calm and professional. Viper 1, you are cleared for approach on runway 3. Wind is 090 at 6 knots. Emergency equipment is notified and standing by. Welcome home. Welcome home. The words hit her harder than expected. Sarah began her descent toward Bagram, carefully managing the power and descent rate. Webb stayed with her, a silent companion who understood without words what this moment meant. They'd flown into combat together. They were flying home together. The damaged aircraft handled differently now. The asymmetrical power was creating a constant pressure on the control stick. Sarah had to actively fight to maintain straight and level flight. Her left arm was burning from the strain. Sweat was dripping into her eyes despite the cool air at altitude. Every muscle in her body was tensed, ready to respond to the next crisis, the next system failure, the next moment where her aircraft decided to try to kill her. At 4,000 feet, Bagram's runway came into clear view. The emergency vehicles were lined up beside the runway, fire trucks, ambulances, a massive crash truck with its rescue equipment ready. The military took damaged aircraft returned seriously. They understood that a pilot flying a crippled plane back from combat was operating at the absolute edge of human capability. At 2,000 feet, Sarah could see ground personnel standing in positions around the runway, watching her approach. Among them, she knew, was her crew chief Rodriguez. He'd be watching his aircraft come home broken, already mentally calculating what repairs would be needed, what parts would have to be ordered, how long before the Viper was ready to fly again. The descent continued. 1,500 feet, 1,000 feet, 500 feet. Sarah's landing gear came down with a mechanical clunk that sounded like music in that moment. The aircraft was responding as designed, even damaged, even struggling, even on a single engine. At exactly 500 feet altitude, the left engine coughed. Sarah's entire body went rigid. Not now, not this close. The engine recovered immediately, but the message was clear. She was running on fumes. The single turbofan was producing just enough power to maintain flight and nothing more. The runway was approaching rapidly now. Sarah aligned her aircraft with the centerline, throttled back the left engine slightly to reduce descent rate, and focused entirely on the landing. This was the critical moment. This was where everything could fall apart if she made even the smallest mistake. At 100 feet, the runway threshold markers flashed beneath her. At 50 feet, she felt the aircraft settle into the ground effect, the cushion of air that formed between the wing and the runway. At 20 feet, she cut the engine power completely. The A-10 settled onto the runway with surprising gentleness. The landing gear compressed under the weight. The tires grabbed the concrete. And then Sarah was applying wheel brakes, feeling the aircraft decelerate, watching the emergency vehicles race toward her in her peripheral vision. The aircraft came to a complete stop, approximately halfway down the runway. For a long moment there was silence. Sarah sat in the cockpit, not moving, barely breathing. Her hands were shaking. Adrenaline was flooding through her system in waves. She'd done it. Against all odds, damaged, struggling, fighting every system failure, she'd brought her aircraft home. Webb pulled up beside her and popped his canopy. Even from this distance, Sarah could see him grinning, the grin of a pilot who just watched his lead perform a miracle. Rodriguez was the first to reach her aircraft. The crew chief was practically running, his eyes fixed on the damage to his beloved plane. When the canopy popped open and Sarah began unstrapping from the ejection seat, Rodriguez's expression transformed from horror at the aircraft's condition to relief that the pilot had made it home alive. Sarah climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs. Her flight suit was completely soaked with sweat. Her hands continued to tremble as she removed her helmet. The Afghan sun beat down on her with merciless intensity. She took her first step down the boarding ladder, and when her feet touched the runway, her legs nearly gave out. The mission was complete. The soldiers had been saved. The legend had been proven real. But the cost, the real cost, was only beginning to become apparent. 2 weeks had passed since Sarah's return to Bagram. 2 weeks of medical evaluations, mission debriefs, and the peculiar form of celebrity that came with surviving the unsurvivable. The maintenance crew had worked around the clock assessing the damage to her aircraft. The official count was 47 bullet holes. The right engine would need to be completely replaced. The hydraulic systems required an overhaul. The structural integrity of the fuselage had been compromised in 3 separate locations. By all reasonable assessments, the aircraft should have fallen from the sky. But Sarah hadn't been flying a reasonable aircraft. She'd been flying a machine designed by engineers who understood that sometimes survival meant exceeding all design parameters. The debrief had been extensive. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything about the Taliban's psychological breakdown. Tactical officers wanted to understand the exact sequence of events that led to the enemy's retreat. Senior commanders wanted to document how a single pilot had turned what should have been a disaster into a victory. Sarah had answered every question with clinical precision, laying out the facts without editorializing, explaining the tactical decisions without claiming credit for anything beyond her own performance. She didn't mention the moment when Mitchell's voice had broken as he asked if she was really Viper. She didn't discuss the supernatural silence that had fallen over the Taliban positions when they realized who was inbound. She didn't talk about the psychological dimension of her reputation, the way her name alone had become a weapon. Those things felt too personal, too much like acknowledging something she wasn't ready to examine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered through the base mail system with the worn appearance of something that had traveled a long distance and passed through many hands. Sarah was in the squadron-ready room, reviewing flight parameters for an upcoming sortie, when one of the junior pilots approached her desk and placed the envelope in front of her. "Ma'am, this came in the diplomatic pouch from Kabul," the pilot said respectfully. "Figured you'd want to see it personally." Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. The letters were precise, military-trained, written by someone who took care with their penmanship. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell. Her hands felt strange as she opened the envelope, as if they belonged to someone else. The letter was handwritten on what appeared to be standard military stationery. There were 3 pages. Sarah began reading. "Captain Chen, I'm not sure how to write this, so I'm just going to say it directly. You saved my life. You saved the lives of 31 other soldiers. You saved the lives of 12 Afghan National Forces personnel. And you did it not just once, but twice. Once 3 years ago in a different valley, and again 2 weeks ago in the canyon where everything should have ended. I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day, about what I saw and what I heard. And I need you to understand something. You didn't save us because you had better weapons or better tactics or faster reflexes. Those things mattered, sure, but what really saved us was your name." Sarah paused in her reading. Her chest felt tight. She continued. "When we called in the distress report, we were losing. We had 3 soldiers down, one of them bleeding out from an abdominal wound that looked fatal. We were pinned down by effective enemy fire from 3 directions. We had maybe 5 minutes of ammunition left before we'd be overrun. I was doing the math in my head, trying to figure out which soldiers I'd have to leave behind because I couldn't carry them all out. That's the position I was in. That's the place my mind was at. And then the controller said your call sign, Viper, and something changed. I could feel it. The fear didn't go away, but it was replaced by something else. Hope. Not because I thought you might save us, but because I knew you would. Because 3 years ago you'd saved us. Because in 6 years of combat your name had become synonymous with survival. The Taliban fighters felt it too. I heard them on the intercepts, asking each other if it was really you. Fear spread through their positions faster than any tactical maneuver could have achieved. When you came in hot, when you started making those gun runs, they broke. Not because they were cowards, but because they were human. Because even hardened fighters understand that some battles can't be won. Sarah had to pause again. Her vision was blurring. She set the letter down on her desk and took several deep breaths before continuing. "Ma'am, I need you to understand what you've become. You're not just a pilot anymore. You're not just a skilled warrior with exceptional tactical ability. You're a guarantee. When soldiers hear that Viper is inbound, they stop being afraid because they know that they're going to survive. That's a level of responsibility that I can't even comprehend." The 19-year-old kid from Kentucky that I mentioned in my initial report, his name is Marcus Webb, no relation to your wingman, I think. He woke up after 3 days in surgery. First thing he asked was if he could thank Viper in person. He wanted to know if you'd come see him before his medevac to Germany. He's going to recover fully. He's going to go home. He's going to live out his life. And every single day of that life, he's going to remember that Viper saved him. I need to tell you something else, something that I think is important for you to understand. Being a legend carries a cost. I can see it in reports that come through about you. I can see it in the way pilots talk about you, with reverence, yes, but also with a kind of awe that borders on fear. You've become something more than human in their minds. You've become invincible, and invincible people don't get to be vulnerable. They don't get to be scared. They don't get to be anything less than perfect. I don't know what that's like, ma'am. I hope I never find out, but I wanted you to know that I see it. I see the weight you're carrying. And I wanted to thank you not just for saving our lives, but for carrying that weight on all our behalves. The 3 soldiers I mentioned, they're all going home. All of them. The one with the abdominal wound, the one we thought was going to die on that canyon floor, he's going to walk off this aircraft under his own power. He's going to hold his wife. He's going to see his kids grow up. And that's because of you. That's because you chose to break contact with a routine patrol to answer a distress call. That's because your reputation was so terrifying that enemy fighters literally couldn't fight through their fear. I don't know if that makes you feel proud or horrified or something in between. I just know it's the truth. And I wanted you to hear it from someone who was there. From someone who felt the fear and then felt the relief when Viper arrived. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you for being the legend that saves us. Respectfully, Staff Sergeant James Mitchell. P.S. Marcus asked me to tell you something. He said, "Tell Viper that she's the reason I'm going to live. Tell her that every day I get to live from now on is because of her. Tell her that she's not just a legend, she's an angel." Sarah sat very still after finishing the letter. The ready room around her seemed to fade away. The sounds of other pilots, the hum of equipment, the distant roar of aircraft engines, all of it became background noise to the sound of her own heartbeat. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in her flight jacket over her heart. Tomorrow there would be another flight. Tomorrow she would climb into the cockpit of her aircraft and become Viper again. Tomorrow soldiers would know that they were safe because the legend was overhead. But for this moment, Sarah Chen sat alone in the ready room and understood, finally and completely, what her call sign had cost her and what it had given to others. She was no longer just a pilot. She was a promise. She was salvation. She was the reason that some soldiers got to go home and hug their children. And she understood that she would carry that responsibility for every remaining day of her life. Sarah pulled out her notebook and began to write a response to Mitchell. Her hand was steady now. Her mind was clear. She had found peace with what she had become, not because the burden had gotten lighter, but because she finally understood why it mattered. The legend of Viper would continue, and every soldier under her watch would come home. That was enough. That had to be enough. Because in the end, that was what being a warrior truly meant. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.